Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our Navy League Learns webinar series. I'm Luke Lorenz, Director of Government Affairs at the Navy League, and today's moderator. I'd like to introduce to you Navy League National Executive Director Mike Stevens, retired 13th Master Chief Petty Officer of the Navy, who is with us today to help us kick off this event. Sir, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Luke, and hello to everyone. And thank you for joining us for another edition of our Navy League Learns webinar series. Today, we'll be hearing from retired Navy Captain and Naval Historian Dr. Jerry Hendrix on the topic, why the U.S. must become a sea power again. Thank you to our sponsor, Fenton Carey Marine Group, for making today's webinar possible. Today's topic gets at the heart of our organization's mission of why it is critical to support the United States Maritime Forces. A retired Navy captain, Hendrix staff assignments included tours with the Chief of Naval Operations Executive Panel, the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, Force Development, and the Office for the Secretary of Defense of Net Assessment. From 2011 to 2012, he served as the Director and Designated Federal Officer of the Secretary of the Navy's Advisory Panel. He also served as the Director of the Naval History and Heritage Command. Hendrix is currently the Vice President of Telmus Group, a defense forecasting, wargaming, and qualitative analysis firm. Dr. Hendrix, sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you, McPon, and it's great to see you again and to work with you on this presentation. I appreciate the invitation to come on and address the Navy League audience, which I think is the ideal audience to receive this message. So it's great to be with you today, and if I could have control of the screen, thank you. We will go ahead and bring up this. There we go. All right. So this presentation I'm doing today is based upon a book that I've recently written on called "To Provide and Maintain a Navy," which of course is derived from Article 1, Section 8, Clause number 12 of the U.S. Constitution, which requires that the legislative branch provide and maintain a Navy. And it goes to really the core of our national interests. One of the things that came up about this, and I'll move on to this next slide, is the question of why I went ahead and wrote the book at this time. And give me one moment here.
Sir, it looks like you have some arrows down there at the bottom of your screen. That might help you to switch over to the next slide.
I'm looking and I'm not seeing that, but there we go. Let's try that. All right, excellent. We'll use that. So why is this book important now? First of all, this is kind of my what did I do during COVID project. I noticed over the last few years that I had written a number of articles, and a number of other people had written a number of articles about force composition. So we had talked about 313 ships, and then we talked about 355 ships. And we've talked a lot about other numbers. The Trump administration at the end came out with a number between 400 and 500 ships. And so the national conversation had really come down to these questions about numbers, size of the fleet, and the architecture inside those numbers. And yet, really, if you look at the national conversation, not the conversation between us within the navalist community, but the national conversation, those numbers-based articles, essays, policy statements were not really going anywhere. Somehow they were not getting traction. And I sort of took this time of COVID to step back and ask the question, why? And so I wanted to get beyond those numbers because it appeared to me that essentially the long-term, nearly 70 years of maritime peace that the world has experienced may have eroded our nation's and our public's understanding about why navies exist and why in particular the United States Navy is crucial to the United States. It was also important, I think, from a philosophical standpoint, to step back and understand why navies were important to the West. And by that, I mean sort of the Western civilization and its approach to the world. And I also thought it was important, specifically at this time of great power competition, that we challenge the concept, which has become accepted, of an assumed peace at sea. We needed to get beyond that. We've been at peace for so long that we just assume as a nation, as a people, that that's the natural state of the oceanic environment. And in fact, it's not. So I wanted to revisit the concept of a free sea, specifically because China and Russia both take strong opposing views of the concept of a free sea. They view that very concept, which is philosophical in its nature, as a threat to them. And I think it's important that we understand that, so we understand the nature of the conversation. Then I wanted to explore how the size of the American fleet over the last 40 years, since 1989, at the end of the Cold War, when we had reached a height over of 590 ships, but it then had gone through this decline in numbers. But how that decline in the size of the US Navy fleet had changed the competition on the high seas, almost to the point where we invited China and Russia to build against us, which they have been doing. And then, only after we have these understandings of sort of these foundational discussions, can we move on to an understanding of how we really must approach our discussion about fleet size and architecture. Again, this is a critical discussion. It's something that we have to do and that the Congress brings up every year when we have the posture hearings and when the CNO and the Secretary of the Navy to go up there to discuss it. But unless we sort of challenge the underlying assumptions first, I think we're going to have a difficulty in selling those numbers because we have to convince the American people that the Navy, again, is important to it, both philosophically and from a national security standpoint, but also the fact that there is a real and proximate, and by that I mean a near-term threat from China and Russia on the high seas. So that's why I set out to write this book. And I want to kind of proceed with you through the book and some of the key concepts of it over the next few minutes, and then we'll take questions at the end. So one of the things I think it's important is that there is a difference in perspectives between land or continental powers and sea powers. At our nation's founding, the sea dominated the nation's internal conversations. Regardless of where you were in the 13 original states, north or south, they were dependent upon the sea for their commerce. If you were a southern state that was agriculturally based, then you wanted to export your products to Europe, and then you wanted to buy refined goods from European markets. If you were a northern mercantile business, then you wanted to take your advanced products and you wanted to trade those again with Europe, and you wanted to buy goods from Europe. And so both of them had a seaward look in both their strategy and in their culture and in their internal conversations. And so that's one of the reasons why within the US Constitution that the clause that deals with the Navy says that the Congress shall provide and maintain a Navy. But when it comes to the Army, which is in the subsequent clause right after it, it says that the Congress shall raise and support, meaning that the Navy was the only permanent force that the Continental Congress, or the original Federal Congress, had agreed upon. And then, in fact, the Army was viewed as transitory. And so I say that not because I want to attack my Army brethren. I say that because I want to establish the historical perspective and baseline for how the nation began. However, very quickly after our nation is founded, we began to turn our eyes westward. So we began to conquer the continent, moving into the Northwest Territories and then out into the plains and ultimately to the mountain states, such that by the end of the 19th century, we had essentially closed the American frontier. During that time, we had also experienced the Civil War, which was a land war by and large. The Navy had played a role in the embargo and the Anaconda Plan, but the fact is the land campaigns dominated the Civil War and hence dominated the American strategic discussion. And then we had World War I and World War II, two large foreign wars that occurred across the oceans, but on land, largely land campaigns. We can talk about World War II in the Pacific as being a maritime war, and it was, but a lot of the strategic dialogue was focused on Europe as well. And even the Pacific War was focused on winning islands or geostrategic features. And so our nation's strategic perspective changed to being a continental perspective rather than a sea power perspective. After World War II, well, we had Vietnam, we had Korea, we had then we got into Desert Storm. We had a strategic discussion around the concept of air-land battle, a combination of land power and the Air Force. Then we had Afghanistan and Iraq, which were again really land-centric campaigns, and the Navy itself found itself trying to figure out what its role would be in these land campaigns in order to demonstrate its relevance. The bottom line was that we sort of seeded the conversation about the sea and maritime domains, and this led to what one of my colleagues in DC think tank area, Seth Cropsey, uses the term sea blindness. We sort of became blind from a geostrategic standpoint to the sea and the competitions that were occurring on them. And that's sort of where we are today in so many ways. So this is the story that I think that we have to tell. And when I say we, sort of the naval maritime community, we need to talk about the fact that the sea is the source of the wealth of nations today, tying in sort of the terms, the wealth of nations, you know, from the Adam Smith argument. 40% of the world's population lives near the sea. That's just a demographic fact. People have lived near the sea because they can make a livelihood from it, from fishing or from gathering other goods, the gathering of salt, the distillation. The populations all live near port cities because that's where trade really began. And so you see the chart on the side, sort of this by the spikes that are there, where the population is in the world. And so you see that the human condition is very much tied to the sea. Now, there have been some tremendous changes that have occurred over the last 70 years as maritime and naval trade have grown during this time of oceanic peace, or what's called Pax Americana, the peace of America. Today, 70% of trade by value travels across the sea, and some 80% by volume goes on these large ships across the sea. And that has led, because of we putting so much more of our global economy, an economy, by the way, that comes up to nearly $90 trillion in value year over year. A lot of that is traveling by sea. And as you can see by these AIS tracks, the great density that has grown up in oceanic trade. Now that trade, because of the size and volume associated with it, has led to increased specialization in shipbuilding. So you have both tankers and ore carriers, but you also have container ships, and all of these have gotten larger because the efficiency of moving large amounts of trade and goods by sea has just lent itself that is the way that humanity is going to trade amongst itself. And this has had some enormous impacts upon the lives of the human population. So for instance, this is the literate versus illiterate world population. And if you could look at that timeline down there, if you look essentially at sort of the knee in the curve that occurs after about 1945, when peace comes to the oceans, you see that literacy grows and illiteracy dramatically decreases in our world population. Similarly, if you look at people living in poverty, again, looking at 1945 as sort of the knee in the curve, the strategic inflection point in the human experience on the world, you see this dramatic increase in people not living in poverty and a decrease in people living in extreme poverty. And then finally, and this is pretty amazing, if you look at world GDP over the last 2,000 years, and you look at that dot on the extreme right, where suddenly everything just turns and starts heading up as we look at the world global domestic product, that is 1945. That is the moment where the seas become peaceful and where the seas become free, essentially on a global scale. And how does that occur? Well, it occurs because at the end of World War II, the United States Navy had 6,700 ships. The next largest navy was essentially the British, and they were our ally. And those nations who would make themselves our competitors essentially looked at those numbers and said, well, I can compete with the United States, but I can't compete with them there. The ocean is their domain, and the rules that they have established, well, they have a large enough navy to uphold that. And so that's essentially how we created this safe and peaceful sea. And that's why I believe that the human condition has improved so dramatically over the last 70 years. So how did that occur? You know, where did this concept of the free sea and of the safe sea come from? Well, you have to go back nearly 400 years. And I think this is important because you go back to Hugo Grotius, who was a Dutch legal theorist, who was given a court case by a client, the Dutch government, who had seized a Portuguese ship. And Portugal sued them because under international law at the time, Portugal essentially controlled 1/2 of the world's oceans. The Pope had given it to them. And so Grotius essentially goes to court because the Portuguese sue the Dutch for the return of the value of that cargo. And in the end, Grotius loses the case in the sense that the value of that ship has to be turned by the Dutch back over to Portugal. But in the end, he establishes the concept of the free sea that's been accepted since 1609. And he says that essentially under natural law, which is under God's law, that there is nothing that can hinder a platform or a ship from moving about on the sea. Where the wind blows, that platform can go. There is not even a natural barrier such as a mountain chain or a river like we have on land that can divide one portion of the sea from the other. And so he creates this concept of the free sea, and he writes a book called Mare Liberum, which establishes this as essentially a legal concept, the free sea. And this concept of a free sea and the idea of free movement from one part of the world to the other becomes a foundational principle of the Enlightenment, which begins to come out just some 50 years later. But essentially, it's the free sea and free movement upon it that creates the example of what individual freedom is. And so as we understand the free sea today, understand that we have no concept of individual liberty and individual freedom without the underlying foundational understanding of the free sea. So here's the additional story that we have to tell. This is the time of Pax Americana. Now, out to the right is a chart that I created, maybe a little fuzzy, but the fact is this is the number of naval battles that occur essentially per century over time. I went back, into the historical records at the History and Heritage Command, went through a number of books to look at just how many sea battles, sea wars, exchanges between nations occurred over time. And as you can see, you get to that right at 1945, and it just drops off. Now, that is not to say that the sea has been entirely peaceful. We all can remember incidents of piracy. We also know about the Falklands War. We know of some individual battles that occurred off from Vietnam, etc. But the fact is, it's a relatively small number. The sea truly has been a peaceful environment for most of the last 70 years. After World War II, the US has become a global power in the sense that it has interests everywhere. Now, this chart is one that I also created some years ago when I was working in OSD policy in the Office of Force Development, and we were looking at how many ships that we were actually required. I was tasked to go ahead and look at COCOM requirements, the regional combatant commanders, Southcom, CENTCOM, EUCOM, Pacific Command, and look at what their requests for services from the US Navy were and where those ships were required to be. And as I looked through that, I identified these maritime regions of the world where the COCOM said it was necessary to have a US ship come and visit in order to uphold a specific US interest. And so when you start thinking about what it takes to keep a ship forward deployed, or ships in some cases, because carrier strike groups or amphibious ready groups are more than one ship, then you begin to then generate what your force requirement is. In some cases, it takes 3 ships to keep one ship forward deployed. In other regions, it takes 4 ships. And in some specialized cases, it's almost a 5-to-1 ratio. And so that's where I started to step back and say, well, how many ships do we need? Also, after World War II, the US Navy began to shift its deployment pattern. This is something that people today can understand. This comes from a Center for Naval Analysis brief that the legendary Captain Peter Schwartz developed some years ago. Peter is a great mentor of mine and so many other people. But this gets into the idea that after World War II, we became a hub and spoke fleet. We had the home fleets, Second Fleet and Third Fleet, that trained up ships and crews and then forward deployed those ships and crews out to the 7th Fleet and the 6th Fleet, and then we created 5th Fleet. And today, there's been a suggestion from the previous Secretary of the Navy that we actually recreate 1st Fleet out in the extreme Western Pacific. And so this hub and spoke method became the way that we addressed these maritime regions and the demand signal to have ships forward deployed. But we need to understand it is this hub and spoke model that has created this period of Pax Americana and kept the seas free and safe. Again, it's been a time of amazing economic growth and improvement of the human condition worldwide. This is just one graph that I grabbed from the World Trade Statistics Review that looks at the overall growth of world exports over essentially since 1948. And as you can see, it's just been a significant climb because the people believe that the seas are safe and the seas are free. However, hence the line at the top here from the great poem, things fall apart, the center cannot hold. The fact is that we've seen that the seas have become increasingly challenged. If you look, and I've focused on essentially the US-China conversation and competition within this graph. As you look across the chart, you will see a blue line. That is the battle force size of the US Navy starting essentially at the end of the Cold War, 1989 on the left, and then through to the present day on the right. And then overlaid within that are significant historical events that have occurred over essentially the end of the Cold War 40 years ago. So in the green area, it's very clear that the US still has dominance at sea and that no one is moving against us. The Soviet Union has dissolved and China has not decided to step up. In fact, at the end of the Cold War, the Chinese Communist Party is pursuing what they call a near sea active defense, which is they're going to defend their coastlines inside the first island chain, but they're not going to venture out of that into a blue water domain. And then, of course, the Cold War ends, and then we have Desert Storm, and it is truly a period of American dominance. But look what happens with the ship number. So we go here from nearly 600 ships that essentially by 1993, we get to the 400 ship mark. And I think that that's an important demarcation line because shortly after that, we begin to see challenges emerge. So by 1995, we have the first mention of Assassin's Mace, which is a Chinese strategic approach where they're going to challenge the United States as a great power, and they begin to create what we now call anti-access air denial strategies. Then there's the Taiwan Strait incident, where we pushed a nuclear aircraft carrier as well as a light amphibious carrier and their accompanying escorts through the Taiwan Strait when China was threatening Taiwan during the Taiwanese election. And then there comes the B-2 strike, the accidental dropping of a bomb on the Chinese embassy during our Yugoslavian campaign in 1999. And it's very clear that in this time frame, in the yellow phase, that China has decided that the US Navy is getting small enough that they can begin considering how to challenge us on the high seas. So again, during this period, the US Navy drops from 400 ships down to just over 300 in 2000. Once we're into the red, it's clear that the Chinese have committed. First of all, they formulated their far seas defense strategy. So they've shifted from being within the first island chain, that they've decided that they are going to go abroad, that in fact, they are going to create a blue water navy. And so they begin to create that far seas defense. They purchase some ships from Russia, Submarine class destroyers. They refit those or reverse engineer them to begin creating their own air defense capable blue water vessels. And then we know that they've gone on to create their own aircraft carriers and a larger and larger fast attack submarine force. 2008, China deploys, or the People's Liberation Army Navy makes its first deployment as part of the counter-piracy patrol in the Gulf of Aden. This is a major learning curve for them. And it's very clear that essentially at this point in time, the size of the US Navy is no longer so overawing that it deters other powers from deciding to challenge us at sea. And so that's the key point that I want you to take away from this. So continentalist powers versus great powers in the sea strategy. China and Russia are historically continental powers. If you look to the right, these are charts that show the historical growth of these nations. They are continental powers that expand to essentially absorb outer challengers and then bring them into their government. So both China and Russia essentially have always looked towards the rising power on their borders, on their land borders, and choose to incorporate them into that. So that's the way they view things. They tend to build barriers, they build walls, or they absorb. They have traditionally viewed the sea with concern, not as a medium of exchange, not just as a medium of exchange, but also as a medium for the transmittal of dangerous ideas. They have a concern as autocratic states and as states that essentially are dictatorial in nature. They have concerns with the idea of freedom. Free sea equals individual freedom. They are uncomfortable with the idea of transmittal of ideas. And you can see that in particular with China, with their views on Hong Kong, which is a free trade capital of the world. And the Chinese need to kind of put that down. And now you see their increased focus on Taiwan. Again, another free capitalist Chinese Asian society that's succeeding. And China wants to make sure that they get that idea under control before it spreads inland into their internal culture. So China has invested in a larger navy, but they've also invested in sensors, missiles, aircraft, as well as these artificial islands to create these offshore buffer zones or great walls. Admiral Harry Harris a few years ago called the artificial islands the great walls of sand, and I think he's dead on. This is how the Chinese have begun to view the sea, is the need to create these barriers, just as they created the Great Wall of China to keep the Mongolians and the Manchurians at bay in the past. Today, they're looking at creating great walls at sea in order to push the United States Navy far from their shores so that the US cannot influence events ashore in their own domestic political environments. But at the same time, both Russia and China have become increasingly dependent on overseas resources. China does not have the energy to run its own economy, does not have the raw resources to drive its factories. And so it's dependent on imports from Africa, Australia, and South America to fuel its factories, as well as fuel its cars and its economy. It gets its oil and energy from the Middle East. So they are dependent on that flow. They are also dependent on the West to buy their resources. They do not, or their finished products. They do not have a large enough middle class to buy their finished products. And so they're also dependent on export economy. They realize that the sea is the major threat to their domestic tranquility, in the sense that if someone steps in and shuts down sea trade, either coming into their country or going out, that it could be the end of their, essentially the Chinese Communist Party's control of their own government. And so they become very concerned on that. And hence, both of these nations, China and Russia has similar stories, but for time purposes, I'll kind of move on. But both of them have begun to make these internal waters claims. So both China and Russia in the Arctic and China in the South China Sea, with its famous 9-dashed line map from 1947, are essentially wanting to claim these portions of the high seas as internal waters, almost as if we view the Mississippi River or the Great Lakes like Lake Michigan, which is truly an internal lake of the United States. China wants to treat these portions of the high seas in that way so they can control not only the trade and the movement of military assets, but that they can control the movement of ideas across that. So the challenge of our time is, how do we address this? Now, I've always had a tough time trying to come up with like the picture or the graph that explains what it is that the Navy does. So, here's a sine wave where the lower part here on the left would be sort of what we do in peacetime, and then the upper part would be something that would be reflective of how we do wartime. Someone used this during a QDR team that I was involved in back in 2010, and I thought it didn't quite get there. I actually was kind of fascinated by the use of the Fibonacci curve. I've always been sort of inclined towards math. And this sort of spoke to me because in my mind, this is what the US Navy does. In sort of the red section, that's your high-end warfighting capability. And then as you spiral out, you get into sort of the lesser included missions, whether it's deterrence or whether it's HADR or whether it's just steady state operations providing naval presence. The fact of the matter is we do very little war fighting, and yet it's absolutely critical that we have that capability, that intense red section of this chart. We do a whole lot of naval presence missions, which are really critical because that's where we both establish and protect the rules and norms. So what type of forces am I talking here? Well, you have your carrier strike groups and your SSGNs and your SSNs. That's essentially your high-end force. That's the I'm going to win the war tomorrow if it starts today force part of the Navy. And then you've got the low-end force, which is your naval presence, day-to-day engagement. It's the cop on the beat that's there to make sure that the broken windows don't begin to accumulate in the maritime global environment, such that we start to see the neighborhood begin to run down and destabilize. And so these are the types of ships in the proper balance that I feel that we need to invest in. You need to maintain that high-end win the war force, but you also need to make investments in balance in the low-end frigates, these smaller USMC amphib ships that the Commandant is now talking about. And then you need to do that in a balanced way. Now, one of the things I want to make very clear, none of this is going to be cheap. The fact of the matter is to grow the Navy, you're going to have to spend more on the Navy. So I don't want to have anyone say, well, we could do this, more with less. We've gone way beyond those days of the conversation of trying to do more with less. We practically caused problems with the fleet. If you think of 2017, the year of collisions and groundings, I think that was an outcome of trying to do more with less. We need to make the case about why the Navy is important and why it's important that we spend more on growing it. And that's part of this book and part of this message with you all today. So today, I think our nation has to step back and make a decision, by land or by sea. The sea does form the basis of our national interest, as well as our philosophical outlook. The free sea is foundational to the very concept of Western freedom. Our competitors across the nation, or across the seas, China and Russia in this case, have chosen the commons to be the area where they want to compete with us. They feel that they are threatened by what comes across the commons. And when I talk about the commons, it's the seas, but it's also cyber, and it's also space. Anywhere where it's soft, that's where they want to push, but that's where information comes into them. And so they want to push us away from their shores, whether it's the maritime shore or even, quite frankly, controlling input of data through cyber or even through space. They want to control what comes into their country because they feel that it can be destabilizing to them. And we have struggled as a nation, I think, far too long, in many ways, to be all things to all people, to be both a land power and a sea power. And so I think at this stage of our history and the fiscal environment, we have to make a strategic decision. And I believe that decision is to move back consciously towards being a sea power again. The nation, again, has to make a decision to become a sea power state. So what does that mean? What is a sea power state? Well, to become a sea power state, we would need to rebuild our shipbuilding industrial base. not just the shipyards where we build Navy ships, but we have to build resiliency and redundancy into it. We have to need ship repair yards. And we also have to invest in the downstream suppliers of parts and materials. In many cases, we have single point failure suppliers where only one company in the United States makes an individual component that we need on our ships. We have to get beyond that and start growing the defense industrial base. We also have to grow our civilian merchant fleet and well as the military logistics fleet. So we have to make an investment in that. And in the end, that's going to be good for us on the naval side too, because it helps create a trained workforce. And the more part suppliers are out there to supply both the civilian fleet and the naval fleet will drive down the overall cost. And then ultimately, I think we have to rebuild our Navy. And in the book, this is the chart that I raise out. And I give the reasoning. If you're going to have 11 aircraft carriers, which is the law, then you need 2 cruisers per carrier. You need 4 destroyers. And then we start building down by presence operations as well as our strategic missions. But we also cannot forget the things at the bottom there, fleet support ships. If you're going to operate 5 carriers across the Pacific, you need a robust logistical supply line. So we have to look at all aspects of our shipbuilding plan going forward if we really want to be a sea power. In addition, we have to take some additional steps. We have to encourage the cultural re-engagement with the sea in our art, celebrating the art that celebrates the sea. In the literature, I think back about Hunt for Red October and how it transformed the national conversation. In cinema, you know, I had a conversation a few weeks ago with former Secretary John Lehman, and he told me, he says, if you think it was an accident that Top Gun came out with all the Navy support behind it at the middle of the same time that we were releasing the maritime strategy, you would be mistaken. The Navy saw that it was important to put the Navy back in our popular culture and encouraging with music, as well as encouraging the funding of endowed seats in academia to explore the sea and on both sides. And then place the oceans at the middle of our strategic conversation as a nation. You know, get out, let's talk to the Kiwanis clubs, the Lions clubs. Let's get out and have conversations in all of our Navy League about the importance of the Navy, but let's get beyond talking to the choir, as it were, and try to engage our neighbors to bring them in on the conversation of how important the sea is in our day-to-day life. My mother worked at Walmart many, many years, and it always struck me that if you really like Walmart, if you really like your big box stores, then you love the United States Navy because we're the guarantor that allows that merchandise to come to you at cost. And then the bottom line, and this is a line from one of my favorite movies, we need to avoid the condition, once again, where oceans become battlefields. It's been a long time since that condition occurred, and none of us want to go back to that environment. And so with that, I'll stand by for your questions.
Well, sir, thank you so much. Let me begin by just, again, thanking you for providing us with your expertise and your insight today. As you mentioned, we will move into our question and answer portion now. And our first question comes from Ed Kaufman, who asks, how does the Navy plan to meet its maritime commitments if it is not able to construct the size of the fleet it needs to meet the growing challenges from China and Russia, as well as maintaining freedom of navigation throughout the world's oceans? Will that require the Navy to maybe outsource ship construction to civilian shipyards?
So I think the Navy is hard pressed right now. In the Cold War, we deployed on a daily basis about 150 ships were at sea at any given point in time. Today we're down, I think the last time I checked, we were in the 80s. It ranges between 80 to about 110 ships per day that are out at sea. And quite frankly, that's simply not enough to uphold all of the interests that we have. And even when we do over 100 ships, especially with a fleet of 297 ships or right around 300, something's got to give. Normally in a normal interdeployment training cycle, 25% of your fleet is in maintenance, 25% is being trained, 25% is on deployment, and another 25% is either going to deployment or coming home from deployment. The fact is we've had to compromise in certain areas of that cycle in order to keep the ships that we do have out there forward deployed, which means we've compromised on training or we've compromised on maintenance. And we know that to be true because of the backlog of maintenance and upgrades of key systems of a lot of our ships. So we have to grow our industrial capacity. We need more naval shipbuilding yards, and quite frankly, we need more civilian shipbuilding yards. That backlog in ship maintenance is something that we really have to look at. I use the example of the McCain and Fitzgerald, the two ships that were involved in the fatal collisions in 2017. When they were brought home to be repaired, it actually took longer to repair them than it did to originally build and commission them. That's because of backlogs in our yards and sort of the lack of capacity for maintenance. So we need to make decisions as a government to invest in our shipbuilding industrial base. This isn't something that we can just let the capital market drive. Our shipbuilding base is a strategic asset in the same way that a carrier is an asset and a bomber is an asset, and the government needs to have a role in managing those assets as much as it does every other part of our national arsenal.
Thank you for that, sir. Our next question comes from Ivan Samuels, who asks, in view of the current budget needs, how can we best convince the public and Congress of some of the shipbuilding needs that you've discussed?
Well, that's what I'm trying to do here, and quite frankly, that I encourage all the members of the Navy League to do as well, is to get out and talk. This type of a conversation can only come from the ground up. I'm going to be having conversations. I'm going to do another event with members of the House of Representatives, a public event in a few days. I want to engage with both Republicans and Democrats because, quite frankly, I think this should be a bipartisan issue. Thus far, the feedback on the book has been bipartisan in support, and so I appreciate that. But I think this is something that organizations like the Navy League were made to do, is to sort of get this type of a message out, but again, drive it more deeply into our home communities around the country, into the Midwest, into the Plain States, away from the coasts. We need to sort of drive this message home to a broader audience.
Roger that, absolutely, sir. Our next question comes from Michael McCarthy, who asks, what is China's present and long-term plan? Now, sir, I know you touched on this a little bit, talking about the Great Wall of Sand. I'd like to add on to Michael's question, if he doesn't mind. How is that wall going to work effectively as a barrier when, as you mentioned, China is so dependent on foreign trade? It would have to be a very porous barrier, am I correct?
Well, I mean, the Chinese are hoping that essentially they can create a sphere of influence in the Western Pacific, and quite frankly, wrapped around through the Indian Ocean and towards Africa and the Middle East. They have created a string of strategic ports, commercial ports to be sure, but ports that can become instantly military bases overnight simply by rolling things out of warehouses like radars and missiles. So the fact is they're hoping to create that sort of continentalist view of sea control by extending the range of missiles and their sensors over the ocean, that they'll create a bubble through which their ships, commercial and military, can move while pushing American ships farther and farther offshore. And so I think that is their strategy. Certainly they're growing their fleet, over 370 ships now, but they're also investing in a very robust shore-based defensive infrastructure to create that bubble or buffer zone under which they can operate, but which they hope to exclude the United States from operating. I don't think that that'll be successful, but that is clearly their strategy.
Interesting. Thank you, sir. Our next question comes from Sean Coffey, who asks, in balancing what will certainly be limited budgets, should the ballistic missile submarine program be pared back to free up money for the rest of the battle force?
No, absolutely not. In fact, the nuclear triad, I think, has to be the #1 priority of the nation, because it's the thing that helps to keep international stability, specifically with nuclear competition between Russia and China, as well as some of the other powers that are seeking to gain those weapons. And so, for instance, the nuclear submarine force, the ballistic missile submarines, that's your assured second strike option. And so, in order to maintain that, which is critical, you need to make that investment. I think the key point here, and the reason why I raised the question of, shall we be a land power or a sea power, and we can no longer be both, is to look very carefully at paring back other aspects of the Department of Defense in order to fully fund the Navy and, to a lesser degree, the Air Force's build out. During the administration of President Eisenhower, he, a 5-star general, cut nearly 500,000 troops out of the Army, going from 1.4 million to 900,000. in order to fund a growth of what he thought to be the strategic assets of the Air Force in the sense of the bombers and the ICBM force, and the Navy in the sense of its aircraft carriers, and then ultimately its nuclear-powered submarines, to include the ballistic missile submarines. I think it's time to have sort of that level of strategic vision, and we need to make some hard choices, again, to become a sea power once more.
Well said. Thank you, sir. Our next question comes from Robert Devine, who asks, can we strengthen these objectives in the meantime through greater cooperation and burden sharing with our regional allies like NATO or nations like Japan? And Robert, if you don't mind, I'd like to add on to that. Maybe you could also touch on our growing alliance with India and how that might work.
We absolutely have to encourage our allies and partners in the regions to make their investments, to be full partners with the United States. One of the challenges that we have is that as we move to sort of the high-tech, exquisite naval force of the 1990s and early 2000s, making significant investments in Aegis-based cruisers and destroyers and our fast attack submarines, which were all extremely high-tech, that in many ways our allies and partners failed to keep up with their own investments. And in some circumstances, we were unable to even communicate because we had advanced our comm gear at a time when they had not. We had also advanced in our weapons at a time when they failed to sort of upgrade their own ships and aircraft to carry the advanced weapons that we were creating. Today, Europe is beginning to spend once again on its own defense. I think now 10 nations of the 29 members of NATO are meeting the 2% goal of defense spending that was agreed upon at the Wales conference some years ago. We need to encourage that they make those spending goals, but we also need to encourage them to spend in the right places. The Japanese are great partners of the United States. They have built Aegis-class destroyers. They had invested in advanced communications. They're building their own stealth aircraft at home. They are a great partner. In fact, they're sort of the epitome of the partnership that we need to encourage. But at the same time, and we've seen this over the last 20 years, there are moments when the United States has to act alone to defend its interests, that there is no natural partner or ally, or perhaps there's even a disagreement amongst friends. And so we should encourage our partners, but at the same time, the United States, what's the old saying, on earth, God's work must surely be our own. And so I think that the US has to make its own investments to be able to stand and uphold its interests without an overt dependence on others.
That certainly makes sense. Thank you, sir. Our next question comes from Matthew Dwyer, who asks, I recently read an article that as a naval force, we do not need to increase the number of ships, but increase the number of arms. It included equipping civilian cargo ships with missile launching capabilities. Is this a viable and possibly a cost-saving option as naval threats emerge across the globe?
The concept of the Q ship, or essentially using a civilian merchant design and then carrying missiles on it, is something that we've looked at. I mean, it's been a strategy for over 200 years. And certainly some of the merchant designs that we're currently building, like at General Dynamics NASCO in San Diego, are coming in much less than what it costs to build a full up cruiser or destroyer. The question is how much do you want to put? How many eggs do you put in one basket? The Arsenal ship of the mid-1990s that Admiral Borda discussed looked at putting nearly 500 VLS tubes on one ship. That perhaps put too many eggs in one basket. And so you have to have that question. The other question you should be asking is, how does that affect the global merchant fleet? If suddenly the enemy finds that you are putting missiles on your merchants, does that mean that all merchants become targets? And what does that do for global shipping, not just for United States, but for all of those allies and partners that we were just talking about? How would Lloyd's of London look at the idea of creating Q ships, knowing that that changes the risk to every other thing that they underwrite? I think it's a serious question that we need to have. It's a conversation. And quite frankly, it's the conversation we ought to be driving, into organizations such as this. But the fact is I think it's something that needs to be explored, but I haven't quite made up my mind on it.
Certainly an interesting topic. Sir, our next question comes from John Kaskin, who asks, according to Mahan, one critical pillar of sea power for a major power is a merchant marine capable of transporting a significant percentage of its nation's exports and imports. The U.S. moves a little over 1% of its ocean commerce on U.S. flagships, while China, an admirer of Mahan, has built up its merchant marine to carry at least 25% of its trade. We don't even have enough commercial merchant tankers to support naval operations. Doesn't this imbalance weaken the argument for maintaining the Navy and that the Navy should be out front promoting the merchant marine?
I absolutely agree. In fact, that's what I put in this presentation. We need to make a significant investment in our merchant fleet. I think that, one of the, mind you, I tend to come from a conservative background. I grew up as a great admirer of President Reagan when I was a young officer. But the fact is I think the Reagan administration policy of essentially deregulating the merchant marine and the civilian shipbuilding industry and sort of taking a government laissez-faire, hands-off approach to it was a mistake in hindsight. The fact is by just essentially turning it over to the capital markets, we've seen this weakening of our merchant fleet and our own industrial shipbuilding base here in the United States. I think that there should be a proportion of all exports that come out of the United States that needs to flow on U.S. built bottoms. We became a net exporter of energy because of fracking and the development of our internal domestic resources. We've begun to become an export manufacturing base again as we've grown manufacturing over the last several years. And I think as we move forward, that the U.S. government again should step in as sort of a guide on this to state that the U.S. We need to have investment in our merchant fleet, and we need to have investment in that civilian shipbuilding base to build the merchant fleet. And again, that has carryover net positives for the naval fleet in that it grows our qualified workforce, and as well as grows the parts manufacturing base, thus lowering the overall cost of building Navy ships. So I do think that we have to make a significant investment in the merchant fleet.
Thank you, sir. Our next question comes from Joseph Ilk, who asks, with the extremely expensive cost of aircraft carriers, what is your thought on a return or a modification of Surface Action Group in which the DDX Zumwalt class destroyer, due to its size, becomes the center of the task force, surrounded by FFX Constellation class frigates and DDG Arleigh Burke class destroyers?
Well, I think that we will have to look at alternative force structures, and I do remember the days when we had surface action groups as a center point in the way that we deployed and operated the Navy. And so I do think we need to come back. I'm not sure how we're going to use the Zumwalts. I've heard discussions about using the 3 Zumwalts as 3 fleet flagships. I also have seen the discussion, because of the Zumwalt size and capacity and its electrical grid, of perhaps making them the center of the hypersonic launch force, because they have room to actually carry the new, larger hypersonic weapons that the Navy is discussing incorporating into the force. Certainly the Zumwalts have to be part of future naval architecture. The frigates are an interesting point to consider. The new Connies, our FFG 62s, we're hoping that we build enough of them to provide that naval presence for day-to-day operations. But because of their design requirements and the speed that they were assigned to, they're not something that we'll see perhaps operate with large surface action groups, except for perhaps the large unmanned surface vessels and perhaps even the large unmanned underwater vessels, where the Connies essentially become the central hub, communications hub for that sort of force that we should be building going into the future. That's another point within that graph that I had at the end. I do think we have to make some significant investments in the research and development of these large unmanned platforms in order to extend both the sensor reach of our Navy, as well as perhaps deepening the magazine depth of our Navy by creating ships that just carry missiles that flow in company with other manned ships.
Roger, sir. Now, this is typically the point where we would get to our last question, but I'm going to push and see if we can fit 2 more in. Our next question comes from Stephen Rice, who asks, how do we solve the current and projected future personnel shortages in the Navy that will challenge or inhibit naval supremacy?
So this is one of the reasons that I put that $ sign into one of the slides. You don't get to do this on the cheap. The fact is the Navy is going to require more money. One of the reasons it requires more money is it's going to require more manpower. The fact is I think the idea of minimal manning, sort of the school of efficiency that took a precedence over the school of efficacy after we sort of came out of the Cold War, we need to reverse that trend. One of the things that you need people for is to make sure that your watch standers have sufficient sleep, that you actually have excess people on board in order to do damage control and fight fires and control flooding. All those things are there, and we need to build back that in. You need to build a war-fighting mentality back into the fleet. Expect that tomorrow the fleet goes to war, and how many men will I need to do that? And so I think that we're going to have to, I won't say dramatically, but we're going to have to grow the size of our personnel force commensurate with the size of the fleet as we move forward.
Thank you, sir. And now we have time for one more question. Our last question comes from Robert Devine, who asks, sir, what is your position on the debate over our severe lack of icebreakers in the Arctic?
Well, actually, I've written on this. I published an article just over a year ago in National Review. The U.S. Navy has not built an ice-hardened surface ship since World War II. We need icebreakers. We need armed icebreakers. The Russians are building nearly 40 icebreakers where they're challenging not only U.S. interests, but also the interests of our allies and partners in the Arctic region. We also need to make some investments in our submarine force. Right now, the Los Angeles class improved and the Seawolf class are the two classes of ships that are quote unquote ice hardened, meaning that their bow sections and their sails have been hardened to surface through thicker ice. The Virginia class itself did not build that into its design specs. And so as the LA improved class goes away, we're going to find ourselves stressed in the high north. So I think the Navy has to pivot, and we have to create an armed naval force that can protect the U.S. interests and the interests of our allies and partners in the Arctic, because it's very clear that Russia intends to make territorial claims up there. And it looks at this point in time, they could very well make them stick.
Sir, thank you so much. Thank you to all of our attendees, not only for joining us, but for providing those interesting questions. Special thanks, of course, to Dr. Hendrix for sharing his time and his expertise with us. And a special thanks to Fincantieri Marine Group for their support. We now have a few closing words from Navy League Executive Director Mike Stevens. Sir, I'll hand it back over to you.
Thank you, Luke, and great job moderating this webinar. Dr. Hendrix, Jerry, your professional background and the work that you're doing just aligns so perfectly with the Navy League. We sure hope that you consider doing more work with us like this, and we'll think of other ways that we can interact. I'd also like to thank all of our Navy League members for tuning in today and for the tremendously insightful questions that were asked. It was really good to hear from everybody. And then lastly, again, thanking Fincantieri Marine Group for their sponsorship. And we'd like everyone to know and encourage you to join us on February 24th for our next webinar, Turning the Tide, a Strategic Vision for the Future of American Maritime Operations. We'll go into depth on the critical needs of our sea services with a keynote from former Undersecretary of Defense, Bob Work. So we look forward to seeing everybody then. Thank you again for joining us. What a great webinar. Have a great day, everyone.
In building tomorrow's Navy, Fincantieri leverages the combined resources and exceptional talents of the 2,000 men and women who work in its 3 Wisconsin shipyards. In a unique system of yards approach, this method of component construction for the U.S. Navy Constellation-class guided missile frigate ensures extreme quality in every detail. It lowers cost and enables the shipyard to meet the ambitious delivery schedules required by the Navy. The lead shipyard, Fincantieri Marinette Marine, will complete assembly and outfitting. The skills of its workforce have been sharply honed from the serial production of the Freedom variant of the United States Navy Littoral Combat Ship, and the shipyard is undergoing substantial facility expansion in preparation for the building of the FFG. America's premier shipbuilding team is committed to delivering a lethal, rugged, and reliable warship to carry American sailors into harm's way in order to project our nation and its interests around the globe in defense of freedom.